Good evening and welcome to this session of Orkney International Science Festival Online. We'll hear tonight about a remarkable man who came up with remarkable insights about evolution. We often hear evolution spoken about in terms of dominance and the survival of the strongest individuals. But this man, who died 100 years ago this year, in fact, said something diametrically opposite. Those species which do best, he said, are those which help each other most effectively. And this evening, we're going to hear his story. His name was Peter Kropotkin, and his life was like a novel. He was a Russian prince who was at one stage imprisoned by the Czar and escaped to England. Our speaker, Alan Dugatkin, is a professor of biology at the University of Louisville. He's published 11 books on evolution, behaviour, and the history of science. He's lectured on his work in more than 20 countries, including New Zealand, Mongolia, and Croatia. If you've any questions for him, please enter them in YouTube's live chat. We'll come back to these at the end of the talk, but now, Lee, it's time to welcome you and hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Howie. I have been looking forward to this very much. I'm thrilled to be part of the Orkney Science Festival. Of course, my one regret is that I'm not there in person, but my understanding is once you get involved with the festival, you always want to come back. So I'm looking forward to that sometime in the future as well. So let me get my slides up here for you and we can get going. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you an adventure tale in the history of science and in the history of politics. So I'm an evolutionary biologist, as Howie said. For the last 30 years, one of the things I've been studying is the evolution of altruism and cooperation in non-humans. And very early on, even during my graduate work, I came across the work of this fellow, Peter Kropotkin. And I am going to make the case tonight that Kropotkin is probably one of the most important scientists that you've never heard of. To get to the point where we can talk about his scientific and political adventures, we have to get a sense of who Kropotkin was. So let me start in the year 1850. There's a grand ball in honor of Tsar Nicholas's 25th year in power, and the Kropotkins were descended from minor princes in Russia, and Peter Kropotkin's parents, Alexander and Elizabeth, were invited, but 8-year-old Peter was not. But then something strange happened, and one of the other boys got sick, and he was going to wear a Persian costume. All these little boys would parade before the Tsar in the country, in the clothing of different countries. And the little boy who was going to come in the Persian outfit got sick, and Peter Kropotkin was called in to do this. And somehow or another, he impressed Tsar Nicholas so much that after all of the introductions of the little boys, the Tsar told Peter's father, this is the sort of boy you must bring me. And what he meant was that Peter Kropotkin was the sort of person that the Tsar wanted in what was called the Corps of Pages, which was sort of the place where the next generation of leaders was to be trained. But that was still a while off because you didn't go into that until you were a teenager. So a young Peter Kropotkin is being tutored at home by the finest tutors. And without his parents knowing about it, one of his tutors is teaching him about these nascent ideas on anarchy that are developing both in Russia and in various places of Europe. And young Peter is really taken by this. And in fact, at age 13, he renounces his title as a prince. A few years later, he does in fact enter the Corps of Pages. Now, by this time, the Tsar is now Alexander II. And Peter Kropotkin is 15 years old. And as he's in the Corps of Pages being trained in terms of politics and mathematics and all of the things that were taught at the school, he is also being introduced to the idea of evolutionary thinking by his older brother, who has read parts or heard about parts of Darwin's Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. So his older brother Sasha starts telling young Peter about Darwin's ideas. Sasha had heard a professor of zoology give lectures on this at St. Petersburg University, calling it transformism. And soon, Sasha and his brother were sharing letters and discussing Darwin and Darwin's ideas. And Kropotkin was becoming really fascinated both with Darwin's ideas, and he's still deeply reading the anarchist literature at the same time. He rises up to be the best student in the Corps, and that makes him the sergeant of the Corps of Pages. And that means when it's time to graduate in the early 1860s, he has his choice of any appointments he wants next. So in 1862, Kropotkin decides that he wants an appointment in Siberia so that he can in part to study natural history and Darwin's ideas on natural selection. So to the amazement of his peers and to the consternation of his father, he asks to be appointed to a mounted Cossack infantry in this newly appointed area of the Amur region, where it's what we would now refer to as the Siberian region. He goes to the Czar, and the Czar asks him, so you want to go to Siberia? Are you not afraid to go so far? And Kropotkin says, no, he's not afraid at all. And so the Tsar says, well, go, one can be useful everywhere. So on July 27th, 1862, a little bit after a month after graduating, Kropotkin, 21 years old now, begins a remarkable 5-year, 50,000 mile trek, primarily through Siberia, a sort of colder version of Darwin's trip on the HMS Beagle. This is my own little map I made up on Google Maps of Kropotkin's travels in Siberia. And again, he's crisscrossing back and forth. A lot of this is in Siberia, some of it is not, but you get a sense of the amount of land Kropotkin was covering in this adventure of his. And he describes his time in Siberia, lying full length in the sled, wrapped in fur blankets, fur inside and outside, the temperatures 40 or 60 degrees below zero. One time, he's trying to cross a frozen river, and the peasants there know that he has something to do with the government, and they don't want to help him because they're afraid if something happens to him, they're going to get in trouble. The only way Kropotkin can get them to help is if he will sign for them an affidavit that says, I, the undersigned, hereby testify that I was drowned by the will of God and through no fault of the peasants whatsoever. This is a sort of environment he was navigating through in his time in Siberia. And there were lots of things he was doing. So his official appointment was to investigate prisons in Siberia, but he was really using this as an attempt to study natural history and Darwin's ideas. And when he went there, he was looking for the dog-eat-dog kind of competition that people were depicting Darwin's ideas in terms of. Darwin was doing this and others were doing this as well. And when Sasha talked about it, he was also talking about it in terms of very, very intense competition, and those who were able to survive that competition left more offspring. And that's the way natural selection worked. They favored the traits that made you more competitive and tough. So that's what he's looking for. And then he writes, I failed to find it, even though I was eagerly looking for it. That bitter struggle for the means of existence among animals belonging to the same species, which was considered by most Darwinists as the dominant characteristic of the struggle for life and the main factor of evolution. But he's not seeing it, even though he's primed to. Instead, what he's seeing is animals giving off alarm calls, warning one another of danger, right? Not out-competing one another, but helping each other. Herds of ruminants or horses forming a ring in order to resist an attack of wolves and protecting the younger individuals while they're doing that. Animals sharing food, huddling together for warmth, playing, all the sorts of things he wasn't expecting to see. He writes, wherever I saw animal life in abundance, on the lakes, in the colonies, in the migrations, especially the fallow deer migration, in all these scenes of animal life which passed before my eyes, I saw mutual aid and mutual support carried on to an extent which made me suspect it a feature of the greatest importance for the maintenance of life, the preservation of each species, and its further evolution. Almost the exact opposite of what he expected to see in Siberia. He also saw this mutual aid and mutual support among the peasants, particularly in little villages in Siberia. He talks about the constructive work of the unknown masses, which so seldom finds any mention in books. The importance of that constructive work and the growth of forms of sociality fully appeared before my eyes, learning something which cannot be learned from books. Kropotkin even developed a theory about the variance that he was seeing in mutual aid in humans. Sometimes he saw a lot of it, and sometimes he saw not so much. And Kropotkin thought that the degree of mutual aid was positively correlated with how far away the village was from the state authority. The less state authority, the more people cooperated with each other. A classic tenet of anarchism. He starts writing about mutual aid in this very grand way. Be it in animals or humans, evolution favored aggregations of organisms trying to find out the best ways of combining the wants of the individual with those of cooperation for the welfare of the species. Practice mutual aid, he begins preaching. This is the surest means for giving to each and all the greatest safety, the best guarantee of existence and progress, bodily, intellectual, and moral. This is what nature teaches us. And that is what all those animals which have attained the highest position in their respective classes have done. He is beginning to think of mutual aid as the driving force in evolutionary biology. Now, he sees it all in the light of evolution. He thinks he's a true Darwinist. It's not that Darwin was wrong about natural selection. It's just that the way that natural selection operated was a bit different than what Darwin and others had argued. Instead of fierce competition, Kropotkin argued, natural selection favored mutual aid, aggregations of organisms trying to find the best ways of combining the wants of the individual with the welfare of the species. So 5 years in Siberia, he ends that trek. Then he goes to St. Petersburg. He's studying mathematics. He goes to the university there. He's studying mathematics. He's translating Herbert Spencer's work on sociology. He's making his name in the Geological Society, so we're not going to be able to get into it. Kropotkin is also a major force in early geological thinking, but mostly he's studying anarchy at St. Petersburg University. After there, 5 years later, he's off to the canton of Jura in Switzerland, which is a hotbed of anarchist thinking. He smuggles back papers into Russia. And so while he's developing his ideas on mutual aid, he's also becoming a more diehard and, from the Tsar's point of view, much more dangerous anarchist. He's speaking of anarchy now as a summing up of the next phase of evolution. The anarchists are becoming a very big problem for the Tsar at this time, and he's beginning to throw the leaders into prison. And that's what happens to Peter Kropotkin next. From 1874 to 1876, he is locked up in the Peter and Paul prison, which is where they put the prisoners that they viewed most dangerous. I mean, it was an awful place to be stuck for anybody, but particularly someone like Kropotkin, who thrived on the intellectual conversation and the writing that he was used to. Basically, he sat in his cell, and he described all the ways he tried to keep himself fit. He and others begin plans for a jailbreak. Their first plan involves a woman outside who is going to let go of a red balloon as a signal that the time is right to try to make the escape in terms of where the guards are. But oddly enough, that one day in St. Petersburg, there were no red balloons on the street. Vendors usually sold them. So that plan failed. So they plan again. And this time, and I'm not going to get into details, it's a very elaborate plan that involves conspirators with a microscope, conspirators with cherries, conspirators in search of a room trying to distract the guards on the outside. And now the plan is, instead of a red balloon, when Kropotkin hears this, he is going to make a break for it. He hears that mazurka, he makes a break for it, and he just gets out. He immediately heads down to the pier, and very shortly after that, he's sailing over to England. When he gets to England, he begins to get into an unbelievably fascinating argument with one of England's leading intellectuals, a fellow by the name of Thomas Henry Huxley. So Huxley got the nickname of Darwin's bulldog. Darwin was not the kind of person to go around giving sort of public lectures on his work, but Huxley thrived on it. And he particularly thrived on it because he knew how much it annoyed so much of the Victorian public that this idea might explain our position in the world and how the history and diversity of life can be explained. And he loved talking about Darwin's ideas. And Huxley, ends up writing a piece called The Struggle for Existence in a magazine called 19th Century. And this 19th Century magazine was basically where all of the intellectuals of the age published. So ex-prime ministers would publish their thoughts on various matters there. Beatrix Potter would publish children's stories there. And Huxley publishes this struggle for existence there. And he lays out his argument about natural selection and the struggle for existence. And I'm going to read you a long quote because I think it's really dramatic and it sums up Huxley and the Darwinian view, and you'll see why it's so infuriated Peter Kropotkin. So here's what Huxley writes. From the viewpoint of the moralist, the animal world is on about the same level as the gladiator stage. The creatures are fairly well treated and set to fight. The strongest, the swiftest, and the cunningest live to fight another day. The weakest and the stupidest went to the wall, while the toughest and the shrewdest, those who were best fit to cope with their circumstances, but not the best in any other way, survived. Life was a continuous free fight. Beyond the limited and temporary relations of the family, the Hobbesian war of each against all was the normal route of existence. This is exactly what Kropotkin thought he would see when he went to Siberia, and exactly what he didn't see. So Kropotkin then publishes a long series of essays in 19th century replying to Huxley. Eventually, those papers are essentially stapled together and put together in this book that Kropotkin calls Mutual Aid. I'm going to just very quickly walk you through some of this. In chapter 1, he talks about mutual aid in animals. So we touched on that a little bit. In chapter 2, he talks about mutual aid in what he was using in the colloquial language of the time, unfortunate as it was, mutual aid among savages. And here Kropotkin writes, for example, if anything is given to a Hottentot, he at once divides it among all present, a habit which is known and actually struck Darwin. So we're seeing mutual aid in what Kropotkin is labeling savages. We're seeing the harmony which prevails on villages in Polynesian islands. Kropotkin also writes about mutual aid in quote unquote savages. Common agriculture became the rule in barbarian villages. Next, he writes about mutual aid in the medieval city. Free cities were a natural growth, a living entity in the full sense of the word. They had come into existence on the coasts of the Mediterranean and all over the world, and everywhere the same revolt took place. The same features passing through the same phases. Co-durations, fraternities, friendships united in one common idea and boldly marching toward a new life of mutual support and liberty. Then Kropotkin has a number of chapters on mutual aid among ourselves, meaning sort of contemporary. And here for Kropotkin, the classic example was the French Revolution before it went bad. And Kropotkin, in fact, writes an 800-page book all about the French Revolution. So now I'm going to give you a sense of how much Kropotkin became an international celebrity because of his ideas on mutual aid. And I'm going to focus on a speaking tour that he came and gave in the United States in 1897 to give you a sense of both the international scope of his fame. I mean, he really was sort of the first rock and roll scientist star in a sense. He comes to the United States and he is followed by the New York Times everywhere he goes. And I'm going to give you a sense of what he was doing. So about the time that he comes here, he has already published or is on the verge of publishing books on mutual aid, not quite out yet, but the essays are, The Geography of Asia, Anarchy as a Political Philosophy, these are all separate books, Anarchy and Science, The French Revolution, Socialism and Communism, The Penal Systems in Asia and Europe, The Coming Industrial Revolution in Asia, and if that wasn't enough, an entire 300-page book on the state of Russian literature. So he comes to the United States, and the first thing he does is he attends the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting in Detroit. So this is the organization that to this day publishes Science, one of the finest science magazines in the world. After that, he takes a train and he goes to Washington and he lectures at the Smithsonian about his Siberian expedition. From there, he takes a train to New York City. And in New York, he lectures to a crowd of 2,000 in a place called Chickering Hall on socialism and modern development. So the first talk is about Siberia. In New York, he talks about socialism and modern development. He then goes to Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and he lectures on sociology, mutual aid, and history to 2,000 people at a place called the Oddfellows Temple. From there, he goes to Boston. And in Boston, he lectures at a place called the Lowell Institute about mutual aid in savages and barbarians and mutual aid in medieval society. He gives other lectures in Boston. He talks about the socialist movement in Europe at Harvard. He gives a talk to the Industrial Club at Cambridge. He gives a pair of talks at a local church about Christianity and morality. And for Kropotkin, those two things were not connected in any way, shape, or form. From Boston, he goes back to New York, lectures on the philosophical and scientific basis of anarchism, the struggle for freedom in Russia, the United States, the great social problems of our country. He then returns back to Russia. In 1901, he comes and gives a second tour in the United States. Then he's set to give a third tour a couple of years later when our president, McKinley, is assassinated, and he's assassinated by an anarchist. And from that point forward, anarchists are persona non grata in the United States. And what's more, Kropotkin, it was a complete fabrication, but rumors were spread that Kropotkin was himself involved in the assassination attempt on McKinley. So by this time, Kropotkin has well-developed ideas on mutualism, both in non-humans and in humans. He is tying those ideas directly to anarchism. He is often making this sort of argument. When you go and you look at animal societies, you see these forms of mutual aid everywhere. And there are no governments, there are no state authorities in these non-humans. And yet we see over and over again, particularly when they're in sort of small to moderate sized groups, we see this mutual aid. Surely, he argues, we humans can do as well, if not better. So after he returns from the United States on a second tour, and the third tour, I say, is canceled, he returns to England and he's thinking more deeply about his ideas on mutual aid. And he has a problem that he hasn't been able to figure out a good solution to yet. And it's really nagging at him. And here's Kropotkin sitting in his study in England. And the problem that Kropotkin has about mutual aid is that he understands it well enough from an evolutionary perspective, meaning over long periods of time, generations and generations. He understands and makes the argument for how mutual aid can evolve. Animals who display it do better than animals that don't. Natural selection favors it. He actually has a couple of problems, but I'm going to focus on one of them here. And that was this. Yes, I have a theory for the long term, for the evolution of this. But in real time, Kropotkin wanted to know, what caused animals and humans to display mutual aid? Particularly, he was vexed by the question in animals. So an animal is not showing mutual aid at time one, and something happens, and then it shows mutual aid. What is it that caused the animal in real time to begin displaying mutual aid? And he's searching for an answer. And he finds his answer in a very unexpected source, and that is Adam Smith. And the reason that I say this is a very unexpected source is that Kropotkin had nothing good to say about Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations work. Kropotkin was an anarchist and a socialist, and Adam Smith's work in the Wealth of Nations was antithetical to the way he thought about political economics. But right, what a lot of people don't know is that almost 30 years before Kropotkin, before Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, he published another book that philosophers will tell you is his best book, and it's called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And it was in the theory of moral sentiments that Kropotkin found the answer he was looking for in terms of how animals, what causes animals to display mutual aid in real time. So let me describe to you the way that Kropotkin figured this out. So this comes from a pamphlet he wrote called Anarchist Morality. And in this, he writes, in the fine work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith has laid his finger on the true origin of moral sentiment. He doesn't seek it in mystic religious feelings. He finds it simply in the feeling of sympathy. You see a man beat a child. So this is Kropotkin talking about Adam Smith. You see a man beat a child, you know that the beaten child suffers. Your imagination suffers you yourself to suffer the pain inflicted upon the child, or perhaps its little tears, its little suffering face tells you. And if you're not a coward, you rush at the brute who's beating it and rescue it. This example by itself explains almost all moral sentiments in humans, as he's telling his reader about Adam Smith. Now, I should note that Kropotkin is calling this sympathy. Today, I think we would describe this as empathy. The notion of you putting yourself in the position of someone who needs help, feeling what they're feeling, that need for help. And that's what drives you to display it, because you're feeling the stress and the anxiety and whatever they're feeling, if you can put yourself in their place. Then Kropotkin says, Adam Smith's only mistake here was not to have understood that the same feeling of sympathy, or what I'm saying we would call empathy today, is found in its habitual state among animals as well as among men. So sympathy, empathy is what drove animals to display mutual aid in real time. So we could spend hours talking about Kropotkin's legacy in all sorts of different venues. As I said briefly, he's also something of an intellectual hero in geography for some of the work he did on mountain ranges in Russia. If you talk to political anarchists, he is one of a few names that you will always hear mentioned to this day. And as Howie referred to in the introduction, this is a special 100th anniversary for Kropotkin, and there are a large number of Peter Kropotkin conferences that are going on all over the world this year. For me, I want to talk to you just a little bit about the legacy of Kropotkin in biology and in my own field of evolutionary biology. So for many, many years, even I would say up to when I was first starting my dissertation in the late 1980s, almost nobody who was real. So there were hundreds of people who in evolutionary biology working on cooperation and altruism. Almost none of them knew the name of Peter Kropotkin. And if you ever saw a Kropotkin reference in one of the evolutionary biology papers, you really got a sense that it was almost a throwaway reference, that the person hadn't read them, but they had sort of realized that maybe Kropotkin wrote this book and they should cite it. But that's begun to change. People in evolutionary biology now recognize that Kropotkin was the first person to develop a full-blown theory of evolution and natural selection and how it can favor cooperation and mutual aid. Darwin talked about it a little bit, but Kropotkin was the person who fully developed these ideas. And people now are beginning to recognize that. They're reading his work directly instead of just doing throwaway citations. Another way that he's becoming more and more relevant in a real sense is that last issue I talked about, this notion that animals are capable of empathy. So over the last only 10 years or so, there has been a real surge in studying empathy in non-humans. Initially, the work was done mostly in primates, which kind of makes sense. But now it's expanded. So one of my own PhD students, Carolyn Driscoll, her dissertation thesis is all about empathy in rats. And if we have time in the question and answer session, I can tell you a little bit more about Carolyn's fascinating work. But Kropotkin is responsible for a lot of these ideas on cooperation and altruism and empathy. And finally, nowadays, he's beginning to get the respect in the sciences that he deserves. And so I think that maybe this is a good place for me to stop my slides and kind of, turn it to Howie so we can open up and ask as many questions as you like. As you might sort of have guessed, I like talking about Kropotkin, and so I'm happy to go on as long as we have time.
Well, it's totally fascinating, Lee, and indeed you've been stimulating a number of questions. I'll start with Richard in Elgin, who asks, do you think that Darwin has been misinterpreted? In other words, what we're told Darwin said may be actually different from what Darwin really said.
No, I don't think so. I think, well, I'll hedge that a little bit. So in general, I think people who know Darwin's work, let's say in the general public, have a pretty good sense of it, and they're spot on. I think one aspect where it's not misleading, it's just that it wasn't a large part of his work, and so people don't know it. Darwin did talk some about cooperation in animals, and he did talk more about it in his book, The Descent of Man, which was all about evolution in humans. And so I don't want to make it seem as though Darwin didn't discuss this at all, but clearly at the time where Kropotkin is doing his work, the emphasis by far is on the dog-eat-dog world. And even today, that's where the emphasis is. And that's not incorrect in a sense, but it does miss a piece of the puzzle that Darwin talked about. But it really was, for Darwin, it wasn't nearly as well developed as the sort of competitive way that natural selection works. It was Kropotkin, and then in the 1930s, a school of people at the University of Chicago, following up on Kropotkin's work, that really developed a full-blown theory for this.
And Mark Dammer asks that phrase, survival of the fittest. He says, could fitness be interpreted as the ability to be compassionate and cooperative?
Well, within evolutionary biology, fitness is essentially reproductive success. It's how many offspring are produced. Now, it's a good question, but technically that's what fitness is, or it's one definition of fitness in evolutionary biology. It's a little broader, but that captures it. But the question is good because really what Kropotkin showed was, yes, Kropotkin understood there were some circumstances in which competition drove who was the fittest, who left the most offspring. He didn't say that everything was driven by mutual aid. He just said that a large chunk of what was going on was driven by it. So in other words, what makes you fit? What is it that allows you to produce the most offspring? Kropotkin emphasized that being nice to one another is one of the things that increases your fitness. So in that sense, it plays a huge role in what determines fitness.
Now, you spoke of that amazing surge towards Kropotkin with the first tour, second tour, planned third tour to the United States, and then the assassination of the president, that completely cutting across it. Was it, do you think, only that, or were there people mobilizing, people who disliked Kropotkin's ideas, felt threatened by them, mobilizing to turn the tide against him?
No, I would say I've seen no evidence of that for Kropotkin per se. Certainly, even before the president was assassinated by the anarchists, there were plenty of people who thought in the United States and all over the world who thought anarchism was dangerous. But I don't think there's any evidence that there was sort of an orchestrated plan to kind of suppress Kropotkin's ideas on mutual aid per se. He would have been in that group of anarchists that they didn't like overall, but nothing on Kropotkin per se. I think that if the assassination had not occurred, Kropotkin would have come back for sure. I mean, the second tour, which we didn't get into, was also quite successful. And I think there was really a call for him to come back from the people who would have gone out to see him. But, the politics just made it impossible.
And what about the First World War? Would it be the case that ideas about mutual aid and humans working together would almost go out of fashion, be driven out by the kind of emotion and the climate that the war would generate?
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. So let me give you just an example of this, and this doesn't deal with Kropotkin per se, but I briefly mentioned this, just a moment ago, that his ideas were sort of picked up by a group at our University of Chicago that fully developed his ideas on mutual aid. And in that group, there were professors, one in particular, who is named Warder Clyde Ali. And the reason I'm mentioning Ali is, in many ways, he was sort of Kropotkin's intellectual heir. Ali was a hardcore pacifist, as well as someone who was following up ideas on mutual aid. And those were very tied together for Ali. And there were newspaper ads, newspaper articles that were basically saying that, these professors who are spouting this sort of thing are, they're expendable. These are the people we should in fact be sending off to fight instead of letting them promote these crazy, dangerous ideas. So there certainly was that kind of reaction once the war began. And Kropotkin does talk some about World War I. I have to admit, I don't know that side of him all that well, but certainly people who were like him were suffering for their ideas.
There's an interesting question just come in from Ruslan Medjetov about the extent to which Kropotkin's political views may have influenced his ideas on evolution. And then the question, is there a contrast with Huxley in that regard?
Sure, it's a great question. I talk about this kind of at length. I have this book called The Prince of Evolution, and in there I really get into this. I wanted to get into it in the talk, but I thought it would run me too long. So basically, here's the answer. There's no question that there was a deep interplay between Kropotkin's ideas on evolutionary biology and mutual aid and his ideas on anarchism. I wouldn't say, I think I'd be hard pressed to say that it was one way, either way. It was constant sort of give and take. Initially, I would say, you know, he went there thinking about Darwin's ideas on competition, and then also thinking about anarchy, then seeing what he saw and thinking anarchy is a kind of evolutionary process. You know, there's a historian of science by the name of Daniel Toads, and he wrote this wonderful, if technical book called Darwin Without Malthus. And he makes this beautiful case that, you know, if you look at Kropotkin, right, you see him developing in this world where anarchy and socialism are sort of the predominant new political philosophies that are making their way throughout the land of Russia. And of course, Huxley is sort of this well-bred Victorian scientist living in a world of Victorian ideas. And what's more, that clearly influenced his science, right? I mean, this sort of dog-eat-dog, hyper-competitive world. And if you look at Huxley's science, you can see that he writes it as a Victorian sort of cast in this intense competitive mode. And in his letters, he even describes, you see the same kind of connection sometimes, not as often, but sometimes that you see in Kropotkin's letters, where he's talking about mutual aid anarchy being the next phase of mutual aid. There is that connection between Victorian competition and capitalism and Huxley's ideas versus mutual aid and socialism and anarchism and Kropotkin's perspective. There's just no question about it.
Would you say, just overall looking at the world today, in which we have an enormous amount of competition and an attitude of dog eat dog, that maybe now Kropotkin's ideas are something whose time has come?
I mean, I could give you my personal opinion, but I would say, you know, I'm in no position where I think I really have much more to say on this than anybody else. But I will tell you, yeah, I think so. I mean, in fact, if you, you know, for these conferences that I've been telling you about that have been going on all over the world in honor of this 100th anniversary, you know, some of the people that are involved are talking about things like how the response to COVID and the pandemic, that there were these mutual aid groups that were spontaneously formed and began linking to each other, helping one another. And these people who were doing this were very driven by Kropotkin and other thinkers like him. There's also, you know, there are many more movements to have kind of a more communal view of cities and life in cities. And again, these, you know, if you read the people who are developing these and who have developed these city plans that kind of think along those lines, many of them have been influenced by Kropotkin. It's another question whether or not I think it's going to make any significant mark, but I sure hope it does.
That is absolutely fascinating, and there is just so much to ask you, but time has beaten us. But also, Lee, I know you have written some extremely exciting other books, so I do hope that this time next year, when the COVID situation eases and we're back in Orkney again, I do hope that you'll be able to come and visit us. You would be most welcome.
Oh, I would love to do that. I very much look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Just before we round off, I should say that at 9:30 this evening, we'll hear the story of a Scotswoman who began teaching English in Slovenia 100 years ago, indeed, in the same year that, as we've heard, Kropotkin died. We'll hear about her links with Orkney and her mountain climbing. And then at 9:30, the festival club will get underway. But in the meantime, there are just 2 words to look at on the bookshelf: mutual aid. And for our speaker, Alan Dugatkin, there are just 4 words: thank you very much. Thank you. And from us all, good evening.
Thank you.